Good morning, everyone. Let me encourage you to open up to Deuteronomy 4. I'm Gavin, and we're going to have a look at that chapter that Mike read parts of for us. In February 2014, I had the chance to stand where Moses stood. If you have a look in Deuteronomy 34:1, it says he went up to Mount Nebo so he could look into the promised land. That's where it was. He was in Moabite territory, east of Canaan, looking west to the promised land, looking down into the Jordan Valley and across the Jordan River. If my big head wasn't in the way, you'd see the start of the Dead Sea that way. And if you look carefully, you can see the slither of the Jordan River, and off in the distance, you can see Jericho. I missed Moses by 3,300 years, but we were both there. And he was standing here speaking to the second generation of the Israelites. And in Deuteronomy chapter 4, we get the climax of his first speech. And Moses is really applying two great truths about God. God is holy. And there's a cluster of thoughts connected to his holiness, his goodness, his justice. He is not wicked. He is not fickle. He is holy. And from his holiness flows his justice. Holy is his character. And I think this truth will help us to think about war when we get to it in the latter parts of Deuteronomy. A mistake we make is underestimating the holiness of God and overestimating the holiness of people. God is holy, and his holiness exposes our lack of holiness, which really leads us to the second great truth about God. God is merciful. The Hebrew word is literally unconditional love. And again, there's a cluster of related ideas. God is merciful. He's loving. He's forgiving. Mercy is part of who he is. Mercy is God's character. And from his mercy flows forgiveness. And so in today's chapter, we see both these ideas come together. As Mike read out for us, God is holy. In 4:24, the Lord your God is a consuming fire, a jealous God. That's holiness expressed in passionate language. He's actively holy. And God is merciful. Only 7 verses later, in 4:31, the Lord your God is merciful. He will not abandon or destroy you, or forget the covenant with your ancestors. God is merciful. He remembers his promise to Abraham and his descendants, that through him the nations will be blessed. Now at this point, I know that some of you are already wrestling with this and asking good and deep questions about how the holiness of God and the mercy of God come together. And at this point, I want to remind you of our QR code. We're taking questions, and it helps the preachers hear what you're asking so we can address some of these deeper questions along the way. Chapter 4 is the climax to this first speech in Deuteronomy. Moses says, "Now Israel, hear the decrees and the laws that I am about to teach you. Follow them, so that you may live and go in the land and take possession of the land that the Lord your God, your ancestors, is giving you. Hear and follow. Hear the decrees of the Lord and follow them. Hear the word of the Lord and follow him. Hear the words written down for you by Moses, given to him by God, and live by them." And so we're encouraged here to be people who hear the word and follow it. And in verse 6, we see a greater vision that God has, that as Israel and God enjoy relationship together, they will be a light to all the nations. We could say a lot more about that. So I want to spend the rest of our time thinking about, what does following the Lord look like for us? If God is holy, what does it mean to follow a holy God? We honour his holiness, we remember what he has done, and we flee idols. And if God is merciful, what does following a merciful God look like? We seek his mercy, and we remember his mercies to us. This chapter really introduces some of the great themes of the rest of the book. Let me come to that first question. If God is holy, what does following a holy God look like? In verse 9, Moses says, "Be careful and watch yourselves closely so that you do not forget the things that your eyes have seen, or let them fade from your heart as long as you live. Teach them to your children and to their children after them." And what Moses does is he gives his people 3 examples of God's holiness that they've already experienced. In verse 3 and 4, "Don't forget the holiness of God in his judgment at Baal Peor." Now, if you're newish to reading this part of the Bible, you might be thinking, what happened at Baal Peor? It's worth noticing at the end of Deuteronomy 3 are these words, "So we stayed in the valley of Baal Peor." Whatever happened there happened recently. It's only in the last few weeks. And Moses says, remember the holiness of God in that incident. And I can take you back to Numbers 25. And at the beginning of 25, it says this, "While Israel was staying at Baal Peor, the men began to indulge in sexual immorality with the Moabite women." In the ancient world, sex and religion went together. Prostitution was part of the way that you worshipped the gods of the nations. The Moabite women had invited the Israelite men to the sacrifices and to their gods. The people ate the sacrificial meal and bowed down to these gods, and Moses says Israel yoked themselves to Baal of Peor, and the Lord's anger burned against them. He sent a plague against the Israelites. And in 25, 8-9, it says, those who died in the plague numbered 24,000 people. Now I'm going to let you go home and read Numbers 25 so you can learn how God's justice was satisfied. But Moses, speaking to the second generation, says, don't forget the holiness of God. Don't forget what happened at Baal Peor. Don't forget that your holy God takes sexual sin seriously. Don't forget that your holy God takes idolatry seriously. It's an invitation for us to stop and take seriously our own failures in these areas. And it drives us to seek his mercy where we have failed. We'll talk about mercy a little bit more. The second example, Moses says in verse 10, don't forget the holiness of God in his words and power at Mount Sinai. And in verse 10, we get a flashback. Moses says, remember the day you stood before the Lord your God at Horeb, that's Mount Sinai. Remember when he told us to assemble the people before me to hear my words so that they may learn to revere me as long as they live and that they may teach their children. This is the children that he's speaking to. And Moses says, don't forget the holiness of God when he met with us at his mountain. He came near and stood at the foot of the mountain while it blazed with fire to the very heavens and the black clouds and the deep darkness. And the Lord spoke to you out of that fire. Do you remember that? You heard the sound of words, but saw no form. There was only a voice. He declared to you the 10 commandments, which he commanded you to follow, and wrote them on the stone tablets. And he directed me to teach you these laws. Don't forget the holiness of God at Mount Sinai, where God spoke to you in fire and mountain and cloud, speaking his words to you. Do you know what you were doing on the 15th of June 1984? Anyone remember? I remember. I was at the Hordern Pavilion. I was at Red Sails in the Sunset Tour for Midnight Oil, and it was awesome. It wasn't my favourite album, but it was a fantastic stage show. Older than Kosciuszko. I don't know if you want more. More? No. Andrew's giving me these. My point is this: from me here to the Hordern Pavilion in 1984 is the same gap between Moses there in Deuteronomy 4 and Mount Sinai. And if I can remember the wonder and power of Peter Garrett, how much more are they to remember the wonder, power and authority of the God who spoke to them? Don't forget the holiness of God, Moses says to his people. There's a third example. Don't forget God's judgment on me, says Moses. I can take you back to Numbers 20. The Israelites were grumbling because of their lack of water. Moses, in his frustration, lashes out in impatience. And in Numbers 20, we read this: Moses raised his arm and struck the rock twice with his staff. Water gushed out, the community and their livestock drank. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust in me enough to honour me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land that I give you. These are the waters of Meribah, where the Israelites quarrelled with the Lord and where he proved holy among them. Psalm 105, amongst other psalms, commemorates this moment of God's holiness and justice. The holiness of God takes the failure of his leaders seriously, even Moses. So standing on the edge of the promised land, looking in verse 21, Moses says, the Lord was angry with me because of you. And he solemnly swore that I would not cross the Jordan or enter the good land the Lord was giving you as an inheritance. I will die in the land and I will not cross the Jordan, but you are about to cross and take possession. God's holiness takes even the failure of his leaders seriously. And these three examples give us the opportunity to see, not to forget the holiness of God as he has acted in history. I want you to notice that God's holiness brings justice not just to Canaanites, but to God's own people. He's not a fickle God. He's a holy God. He's consistent with his character. And we who live this side of Jesus are reminded not to forget the holiness of God that saw Jesus drink the cup of God's wrath on our behalf at the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? It's tempting for us, isn't it, to undermine the holiness of God, to let the respectable sins slip by. Deuteronomy 4 reminds us, don't forget the holiness of God. There's a second way we honour God's holiness. It's by not making idols. Now, I could say a lot more about this, but let me note a couple of things. We take God's holiness seriously when we don't worship things that aren't God. when we don't make other things in our life more important than the God who made us for relationship with him. Deuteronomy has a lot to say about idolatry, and we'll see that in these next few weeks. Idolatry is the capacity of the human heart to make gods of things that aren't gods, to treat them as if they are God and push the true and living God to the side. We see what Moses says here in verse 15, "Watch yourselves carefully so that you do not become corrupt and make for yourselves an idol of an image of shape, whether formed in man or woman," and he goes on. We get an interesting insight into idolatry in the days of Moses. Here was the temptation to make graven images of people and creatures and astral bodies. Moses here says, flee idolatry. Flee making gods out of things that aren't gods. Flee putting your heart on something that isn't God himself. And so in verse 23, Moses says, "Be careful not to forget the covenant of the Lord your God that he made with you. Do not make for yourself an idol in the form of anything the Lord your God has forbidden. For the Lord your God is a consuming fire and a jealous God." And we're going to see this call to flee idolatry all the way through Deuteronomy, including commandment number 2 in the next chapter. Last Wednesday at Wednesday Fellowship, I was a bit underdone. I croaked my way through the second commandment, the challenge not to make gods out of things that aren't gods. And at the end, afterwards, someone came up to me and said, "I know what the new God is that we all worship." And then he got out his phone and he went, "Here it is. Here is your God. It speaks to us. We listen to him. We bow the knee to him." And I understood the point that he was making. What are the new gods that replace the true God in our hearts? I was curious to read about Dan and Mel, our mission partners in Kathmandu. They tell lots of stories. It's really worth linking up with their information. Dan went with one of the pastors and met a lady in her late 50s who had got a gathering of her friends together so that they might hear about Jesus. He said the ladies were of different castes and different parts of the country, but they had bonds as friends. He said a young mum from a high caste family said from the outset, "All these religions seem the same. We do all these rituals, but they don't help us." And as we shared the gospel, Dan writes, we emphasised that God is not a God made with hands or merely a product of human tradition, but he is a living God who loves us and saves us and helps us in our lives. And he said at the end of their session, she said, "This teaching of Jesus, I like it. The old gods and the new gods are alive and kicking, tempting us away from worshipping the one true God who has come to us in the person of Jesus." There's a second point that Deuteronomy 4 wants us to see. What does it mean to follow the Lord who is merciful? We seek the mercy of the Lord in verses 21 to 38. In verses 25 to 28, Moses confronts his hearers as he looks to the future of life in the land, and this is what he says: "You're going to fail." Not sure if that's the encouraging word you want to hear from church this morning. He said, "After your children and your grandchildren have lived long in the land, if you become corrupt and make idols and do evil in the eyes of the Lord, arousing his anger, he will judge you. He will scatter you." And it's a grim couple of verses. Then we get to verse 29, which says, "But." It's one of the fabulous buts in the Bible. Verse 29, but if from there, from a place of rebellion and judgment, corruption and evil, you seek the Lord your God, you will find him if you seek him with all your heart and with all your soul. When you are in distress and all these things have happened to you, in the later days you will return to the Lord and obey him. For the Lord your God is a merciful God. He will not abandon you or destroy you or forget the covenant with your ancestors which he confirmed to them by oath. Here is the heartbeat of mercy that goes through the whole book of Deuteronomy. We'll see it again and again. If you seek the Lord, you will find him if you seek him with all your heart and all your soul. A cry for mercy always finds the mercy of God. A cry for forgiveness always finds the forgiveness of God. And we who live this side of Jesus know that a cry for mercy finds the mercy of God because Jesus has secured our forgiveness in his death at the cross. If God's holiness demands justice, his mercy provides forgiveness. If the holy God brings us under judgment when we fail him, the merciful character of God offers us forgiveness. So we come to the end of this speech, and Moses says we seek the mercy of God when we remember his mercies to us. And he finishes with a rhetorical flourish. We heard part of it from Mike earlier, like Paul in Romans 8, a series of questions. As we seek the mercy of God, we remember his mercies. Has anything so great as this ever happened, says Moses, or anything like it ever been heard of? Remember his mercies. Has any other person heard the voice of God speaking out of the fire as you have and lived? Remember his mercies. Has any God ever tried to take for himself one nation out of another nation by testings and signs and wonders, by war, by a mighty hand and outstretched arm, and great awesome deeds like all the things the Lord your God did for you in Egypt, before your very eyes? Remember his mercies. And in verse 35, you were shown these things so that you may know the Lord is God. From heaven you heard his voice. On earth he showed you great fire. You heard his words out of the fire because he loved you. Look at verse 37. He loved your ancestors and chose their descendants after them. He brought them out of Egypt by his presence and his great strength to drive out before the nations greater than them, that you might receive the land of your inheritance today. And so Moses finishes this first speech. Acknowledge and take heart this day. The Lord is God in heaven. Above and on the earth below, there is no other. Keep his decrees, which I am giving you today, so that you may go well with you and your children after you, that you may live long in the land the Lord gives you for all time. This is the Lord that Moses set before the Israelites. Now, as we step back, we hear this call to hear his words and follow them. We do that when we honour his holiness, when we remember what he has done for us in the unfolding story of the Bible, when we remember his justice and his mercies, when we flee our idolatries of the new gods and the old gods, when we seek his mercy in our time of failing. And there's one more step I want to take with you. The holiness of God and the justice of God are seen most clearly in the person of Jesus. There's lots of places we see that in the New Testament. I learnt this week that Deuteronomy is the most quoted book in the New Testament. I would have put my money on Isaiah, but Paul goes bananas with Deuteronomy in his letters and gets the count up. Paul writes to the Thessalonians in his second letter, and we see the holiness and the mercy of God come together in Jesus. Paul writes, God is just and will pay back trouble to those who trouble you, and who will give relief to you who are troubled, and to us as well. Extraordinary little verse, 2 Thessalonians 1:6. It contains both the holiness of God and the mercy of God. And Paul says this will happen when the Lord Jesus is revealed from heaven in blazing fire with his powerful angels. We see the holiness and mercy of God most clearly expressed in the person of Jesus. Jesus is holy. He will punish those who do not know God and do not obey the gospel of our Lord Jesus. They will be punished with an everlasting destruction and shut out from the presence of the Lord and from the glory of his might. Strong and powerful words about the holiness of Jesus. But equally are the merciful words, on that day he comes to be glorified in his holy people, to be marvelled at among all those who have believed. And Paul adds, this includes you, because you have believed our testimony. Deuteronomy 4 has set us up to see Jesus more deeply. We honour Jesus, remembering what he has done for us. We seek his mercy at the cross, and will stand with the saved and marvel at his majesty on the day that he returns. Hear these words and follow them. Amen.